actually have adopted or are adopting Agile development paradigms, and we've been able to work with a number of them on how to do security in that particular environment. And so we've just come up with some ideas that we're trying with some of our clients, and we wanted to share those with you and also get your feedback, because I could imagine there's a few people in the room that might be doing Agile development or are thinking about it. So I'm sort of curious about your ideas as well. And there's a few other people in the room who have been doing some research on this as well. Is Johan in the room somewhere? I can't see because of the lights, but is Johan Peters in the room somewhere? Anyway, I've done some, read some of his papers, and some of his ideas are match mine, so those are reflected there. And we also have some differences of opinion that I don't think are major, but I'll discuss those as well, just so you can hear alternate viewpoints and some ideas as well. So Agile has this nice manifesto, and if you heard Jeff Williams' keynote yesterday morning, he was sort of lamenting the fact that Agile is having so much more impact on how people develop software as compared to how much impact Owasp or even the entire security community is having on how people do security. And that's not anything bad in the sense of what Agile is doing. Obviously, they're having great success because they're saying, look, there's been a lot of development paradigms we've had for a long time, particularly these sort of heavy waterfall models. They just aren't working for us. And we need to change the way we build software so it's much quicker, much faster time to market, much simpler for the developers and more importantly, the customers to work on how they build software. So they have this manifesto that talks about, these things are important, but so is this. These things are important, but so is this. But we value the things, on one side much more important than the ideas that are on the other side. So the whole Agile mindset is to focus on these issues that are important. Now, some of the underlying principles of Agile is test-driven development, pair programming, and focusing on little things and doing little things, getting them in front of the customer, then getting feedback and going on and improving them or changing them or what have you. And that's sort of the focus of doing little tiny sprints. So a number of our clients are doing sprints that are like 3 to 4 weeks at a time is the cycle of their sprint, and they'll plan 18 sprints or 24 sprints in a year's time frame or whatever that happens to be. So before I move on here, I'm just curious about how many people are actually doing Agile development in the room. Awesome. All right. So you guys know probably a lot more about this than I do to some degree. So my next question for those of you who are doing Agile is, how many of you guys are really doing test-driven development? Okay, so that's an interesting statistic, right? So if I'm doing the math right, it looked like 20% maybe. So, I mean, Agile is useful in a lot of ways, but there's obviously some concerns about Agile because it is so fast that it might have an adverse effect on quality, right? So one of the things that Agile has tried to say is, like, we're going to do test-driven development. That's going to really help us articulate what we're trying to build before we build it. And then when we build it, we can verify that what we built actually works. And so that is a significant factor in trying to improve the quality of Agile software. So that quality factor that can be built into Agile can help us when we move to security. So there's not necessarily a clear opposite between Agile and security. It's the speed of development that causes us to be concerned about security when we build software in an Agile way. But if we're focused on quality as part of the process, and we have security be part of our concerns, then theoretically we should be able to build secure, high-quality software. And so we're going to just talk about some of the ideas that we have to layer on security in a way that gets us to build secure, high-quality functional software without fundamentally breaking the Agile paradigm. And so at the end, and I don't think this will take that long to sort of lay out the ideas, hopefully we'll have some time for questions and answers, and you guys can say, that was a great idea, or that was a stupid idea, or this is what we're seeing in our environment, so we can try to figure this out. So our goal, of course, from a security perspective is to gain assurance. In other words, that we have the right security functionality, that it's high quality, in other words, that it works, that it's being used everywhere it needs to be, and that it's actually being used the way it's supposed to be used, right? So can we get assurance out of Agile development in terms of security? Well, if you're doing test-driven development, there's a significant focus on high assurance because of the test-driven process. Now, this quote from Johan, I added the functional quote in there because that wasn't directly in the quote, but they're focusing on functional assurance because Agile development primarily focuses on functional user stories. In other words, these are the functions that we want to make available to our users so that this application can accomplish its mission. So that's probably the only reason why it's focused on just functional, is that's tend to be what users want. What do users want? They want functionality, right? So when you go to them and ask them what they want, they primarily tell you about functionality. So because Agile is focused on building what the stakeholder wants, and they don't either know enough to ask for security, or they don't care, well, then you're not going to build a secure application because they haven't asked you to. And so one of the things I'm going to suggest later is we need to help them. We need to encourage them to include security. Now, we can't just steamroll over the stakeholder and say, oh, I'm an expert, this is exactly what you have to do, and oh, by the way, it's going to cost you twice as much, and what have you, because that's not going to work. But I think we need to encourage them. We clearly need to involve them so they understand the risks we're facing and the cost or the schedule impacts it's going to introduce to address those risks. And then we can prioritize the security tasks along with the functional tasks to decide what's important. And functionality might win early on during the early phases of the sprint as we want to prove the application. But over time, as you get more and more of the functionality done, then you're going to say, well, I can't deploy this yet because it's missing these core critical security functions. We got to get those stories implemented. That's where the trade-offs start coming in. So, and I have a number of ideas on how to make that, as efficient as we can get. So, traditional security, which has been around for ever and ever, and I came from that school back in the 90s, was the DoD and big software project waterfall model where we do massive requirements and design and blah, 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 right? And obviously that's what the Agile movement is sort of rebelling against because it's too heavyweight, too slow, what have you. So we got to change from that kind of security model to a model that fits within Agile. So that's what we're going to try to figure out. So this is a depiction of the Agile model. So the way Agile works is you start off with some early processes where you think about sort of the high-level goals of the system and the core user stories at the highest level. So sometimes people call that sprint zero, where they're trying to figure out, okay, what are the main goals we're going to try to build, and which ones are more important, so we need to focus on those first. And then you start going through these various spirals where you build the next few most important stories, then you get them in front of some early adopters to show them when it's going, and then while they're looking at it, you might do some QA and some tests and what have you, and then you're going to go, well, is this good enough, ready to actually go to deployment? If yes, then we're going to maybe do some more detailed testing just to make sure it's good before we release it. Or if not, we're going to go around and around. So a lot of times you go around and around the cycle 3, 4, 5 times before a new release comes out, or you might go through it 18 times or whatever. It just depends on your environment. So the question is, how do we layer security into this process without fundamentally breaking it and against the paradigms of what Agile's trying to do? So here's some ideas, right? So in some places we've already got in here, we can add security into the existing process without fundamentally disrupting it. Certainly, we could develop security stories just like we develop functional stories, and I'll talk more about that later. One of the things we want to suggest early on is you need to think about security at the very, very beginning in terms of at least the high-level categories of security issues you have to figure out. And to do that, we would recommend you do threat modeling, and you might have heard about threat modeling 47 other places, and everyone's saying you got to do it. And we agree that it needs to be done. Of course, not a lot of people talk about how to do it, and I don't have time to cover that in this class. But basically, with threat modeling, you can think about, okay, given the kind of application we're trying to build and where it's going to be deployed and the assets it's protecting and what have you, what are the core risks from a security perspective that this application might face? And then from that, we should be able to come up with some kind of security stories that address those risks. And then we can consider those security stories along with the regular user stories that we're dealing with that are normally generated. Now, again, you're not going to get into heavy detail on the security stories here because you're not ready to implement them. But you want to at least get the high-level ideas on the table so you can prioritize them with all the other things you're trying to do. And then when you get down into the development cycle itself, when you're doing your testing and your development, you should, of course, include security in there as appropriate for that particular cycle. So certainly if you're working on security stories in that cycle, you would work on those. But you should always have some level of security expertise in there as well. One of the things I mentioned on the right is you could introduce a whole sprint just on security. Now, a lot of people would rebel against that. They're like, well, I'm not going to pause for 3 weeks or a month and just do security. Well, as you're trying to prioritize and organize your work, you might decide that it makes more sense to get a whole bunch of security activities and just focus on them during an entire sprint and getting them all done at once because they're all interrelated. Or you might say, you know, I can't afford to pause like that and just do security, so I'm going to interleave it throughout the entire development. Either model could work, and in fact, a combined model might work. So, I mean, in a perfect world, you wouldn't need that security sprint on the right, and I'll talk about some ways of reducing the need for those kinds of sprints. We also think, and this is backed with some other guys, like there's one of the chief Agile guys at IBM is talking about, you know, what does it make a secure, what does it indicate indicative of a mature Agile team? And one of the factors that they've indicated was having an independent testing resource for each Agile team is really important because there's a lot of non-functional requirements. And my phone might ring too, so I need to turn mine off. There's a lot of non-functional requirements that developers have to deal with that they're usually not super expert in focusing on or testing. So having an external resource that helps you focus on non-functional requirements, including security, is a significant aid to getting this security done right. Now that external tester or that extra resource needs to be a really, really good tester, not just the bottom of the heap tester that didn't make on an Agile team because he can't code. He needs to be one of your top 5, 10% kind of testers who's really, really good at that. And maybe that's his job, is to provide that expert level of analysis on a whole bunch of Agile teams so that, you know, he can spread his or her knowledge of, you know, performance and availability and security and whatever else that is across a lot of teams. A natural thing to do, and even in the normal model, is at the end to do a security review. Of course, and we recommend that here clearly, but if you wait to the end to do it all, of course you're going to completely fail. So we still believe it makes sense to have a gating event at the end to do security, which isn't hugely disruptive to Agile because it's not smashed into the middle, but you need to weave some security into the process. Otherwise, that event's not going to be very fun when you have you know, lots and lots of issues that you've dealt with or haven't dealt with during development. So before we get into the actually going through this in detail, I just wanted to talk about some enablers that would strongly encourage towards. Now, you need all this at the very beginning, and in fact no organization has all this at the very beginning unless they're already relatively mature in terms of software engineering or security engineering. But so you might look at that and go like, well, I don't have that, and I don't have that, and I don't have that. And it's like, okay, that's fine. But I think you should work towards getting this in place. So I think you can actually produce many of these things as you go through your Agile development process, so that, you know, after 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 cycles, you start building some of the things. So for example, standard controls. Like, you might not have any security standard controls today. Of course, I would hope you have some, but you might not have very many. And so over time, as you build them in projects, you can standardize them, and then the next time you're not reinventing the wheel. And I hope many of you guys heard Jeff Williams talk on the Owasp Enterprise Security, because Owasp is building security components, and standard security components, I think they're actually great for all development paradigms. So, okay. But I think when I think about Agile development, and when I've been working with our customers, those that don't have good standard security components have a much more massive struggle with getting security through their Agile process than those that do. And so, I mean, I actually think that it's just the struggle is sort of inherent, right? Not having standard components is going to make any process more of a struggle, but it's particularly painful in Agile because you're trying to go so fast, right? Secure coding standards. If you had these standard controls, then your secure coding standards could explain to the developers, here's how you use the security components that you have correctly, and here's the coding patterns to deal with common issues that aren't related to standard components, like SQL injection, for example. You might not have a standard component for SQL injection avoidance. You just have a coding paradigm that says thou shalt use parameterized queries or prepared statements or whatever makes sense in your organization. Of course, training is critical, and the Agile guys acknowledge that training for non-functional requirements is key in any Agile team for any kind of non-functional requirement. But it's particularly important for security because security is so difficult. So without training your developers on at least the basics of application security, you're going to have a real hard time producing a secure application, regardless of the process that you follow. And finally, ideally you would have expert support, right? Now, a lot of organizations don't have any experts, and those that do only have a very small number. And so they can't put those experts in the team. They got to provide them as an external resource that can aid the teams. So, you need, ideally you would have that expertise. If you don't, we understand. But anyway, these are all things that you should strive to get eventually in your organization. You're probably not going to have many of these initially, but I think you can build up to it over time as you make security and Agile a core competency for you. So let's just talk about going through the whole process and what that might be like. So at Sprint Zero, here's where you're trying to think about the functional requirements primarily. Like, what are the big functions that we're going to imagine this application is going to have someday? Well, I think you need to think about, what are the big security requirements that you're going to have someday? So that's where the threat modeling comes in, and the high-level analysis to figure out what your security requirements might be. Now, normally in Agile, you go to the customer and you say, customer, what do you want? And they explain it, and then you document user stories. So you have all these user stories about all the functionality that they want. And if you ask them, well, do you want security? They're either going to go no, or yes, or I guess so. But they're not going to be able to articulate to you what those security requirements are. And now, so this is where we're going to differ a little bit from traditional Agile. Because we would recommend you do threat modeling and you figure it out, I think you need to figure out what the security requirements probably should be and articulate those in some kind of Agile way, like a stakeholder security story, which I'll talk about in a second. And then you go back to the customer and say, well, these are our ideas and what we think is important to you. And what do you think about them? And particularly explaining to them what is the risk that each one is trying to address. What's the cost and schedule impact going to be if you implement that? And obviously it has a significant effect on, do you already have a standard control for that? Because if you have a standard control and you go to them and say, as an example, let's say you had security logging already sort of licked, right? And so it was really simple for developers to add security events into their system. You might go to them and say, security logging is really important because you can do intrusion detection and figure out what if you've been attacked and blah, 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 blah. And the stakeholder is going to be like, I don't care about any of that. And you're like, well, yeah, but we've already built standard components, and it's in our coding guidelines on how to use it, and it's really simple for us to do, and it really won't slow us down at all, and it's really important, like the corporation thinks this is really important. Then your boss, your stakeholder's going to be like, all right, I don't care, as long as it doesn't cost me money, I'll take it. Now, not everything's going to be that easy, is that you can get security for free, and clearly if you don't have a standard component, it's not going to be for free. And even if you do, it's going to take work to figure it out. So as an example, access control. Access control is probably something you need, but it takes work to figure out what the policy is. And when you go to the customer and you bug them about policy, they're like, I don't have time to figure this out. I want to see the functionality, see what I like it. I don't want to figure out a policy for a piece of functionality that I might throw away. Oh, well, that makes perfect sense. Let's defer that to later on. So let's know that we need access control, but let's defer that, figuring in that detail out till later. Now, you might want to build access control into your system, though, so that when you figure it out later, you don't have to like re-architect your whole application to enforce it. So you might be able to figure out a way to put access control checks in your code when you build it, but initially it's always yes, you can access it, yes, you can access it, so you can build the functionality quickly, get it worked out, and then once the functionality stabilizes, then you can figure out what the policy is for that. So here, this is a little bit different from Agile in a traditional sense. You're suggesting to the client functionality. I mean, you probably are doing it anyway, but I mean, I really think it's a little bit stronger. You're like, no, this is really important. They need to understand the risks that it addresses and the costs, and I think that's important. And then, of course, you would go through these, the standard confidentiality, integrity, availability questions, of course, to help you, because you can't tell them all the security they need, because they own the system. So you can tell them some things. Like, for example, some things like cross-site scripting, for example, that's pretty much something you just tell them. You say, like, there's this thing called cross-site scripting. You can do evil and bad stuff with it. Maybe we have standard components to avoid it. It's probably important. We got to do it. But there's not a lot of input for them to you on that particular topic. But for confidentiality or integrity and availability, it's hugely important. Like availability, okay. How much uptime do you need? You need 3 nines, or it can be down a day a month, or an hour a month, or whatever. That comes from them. And then once you get their high-level needs in this area, you can adjust your security requirements to say, okay, well, to provide that level of confidentiality, integrity, or what have you, then here's the components or the controls I need. And these are the stories that we're going to describe that describe those controls. And here's the cost and schedule impacts of those things relative to the other things that we're trying to build. And you obviously have to take risk into account as well. So to do this threat modeling, there is a threat modeling process, at least at a high level process and a risk rating process that Aspect has put together. And we made it available at Owasp, at the Owasp risk rating methodology. It just basically helps you structure your thoughts on, what are the assets I'm trying to protecting, what are the components, what's the path through the system, what are the threat agents, et cetera, and try to find the risks and rank those risks as to which ones are most important. So just one way of at least starting some basic threat modeling, there's some guidance at Owasp on how to do that. So when you're capturing these risks and you're trying to explain them to your client, the stakeholder, we want to do it in as agile way as we can so everyone involved is doing something that they're familiar with. So we're proposing that you do stakeholder security stories, just like you do regular user stories. So these security stories are written in as positive way as you can about what you're trying to achieve. So in fact, if you look at security in general, there's a lot of it that's functional security, right? Authentication, authorization, security logging, things like that. Now, a number of authentication security mechanisms are more of defensive in nature and don't naturally lend themselves to being sort of positive things, but are more of purely defensive things. They're still features, but they're security features that don't clearly add value to your client, except that they reduce risk that they may or may not be concerned of. So other people have proposed that you write abuser stories. Johan Peters, for example, and some other people, right? And so there's different approaches to dealing with this. It's our opinion that you probably can write them all as positive statements in this way. And if you can, that's clearly what I would recommend, because the more it's like what you're used to doing already, the more natural it's going to be for the stakeholders, more natural for the developers. Whereas if you're writing negative statements, that doesn't sound like a user story and some functionality I got to build. But there's still, I think trying both of these out and seeing what makes sense in your organization makes sense. We believe that this is probably the more natural way for your organization to do it. And I can also imagine a situation where you're writing most of these stakeholder security stories in a positive way, and there's just a few hard ones that you can't figure out how to make them positive, so you create an abuser story. But I would rather not go there until I'm forced to go there and someone convinces me that I have to do it that way. And we're not convinced that has to happen that way. Now, so, okay, that's it. So the idea is you go across this process, you're going to be weaving security throughout your sprints. And so there's a number of ways you can do it. You can weave it into every single sprint along the way, a little bit of security, if you need, as necessary. Or you could sort of queue it up and do a whole sprint on security, or do a combination of both. But it really should all be based on your prioritization scheme. That's what Agile is about, is focusing on what's most important next. In other words, the most functionality you can build in the next 3 weeks, right? And that's the most important functionality, right? So that should drive your prioritization scheme. So how are you, if a little bit of security happens along the way, or you have a big security phase because doing all the security things together in one sprint is more effective and more efficient because of the interrelationships, that's up to you to decide in terms of priority. So if you're following the Agile model, then you're going to develop your test cases for this security functionality, and then you're going to build these security components, and then you're going to integrate them into your environment, and then you're going to build more test cases to verify that your product, your software uses those security mechanisms correctly. Now, clearly, building security components is a big, expensive thing. And it's probably not something you're going to be able to easily do in a typical Agile sprint, depending on how sophisticated the component is, right? So you might be able to build little pieces and get it more fancy over time, right? So maybe you can build login first, and then the next phase you build like change password and recover password, and the next phase you build create an account and whatever. So you can build little pieces. But if you have standard components, then it's configuring those components and integrating them in and testing that they're integrated right is all you're doing, and you're not building them, which of course is going to make you a lot faster, right? So by implementing these security stories with test-driven development, we can try to avoid the common problems that we're seeing. So this chart is the same chart that Jeff used yesterday in the SAPI project. It's the same thing. We're trying to avoid missing security controls, broken controls, controls that are ignored, and controls that are not used right. So if you've got a test suite for your standard security component, or you build the test suite before you build the component, then you can avoid clearly the missing and broken part, and then just good design can help you make sure that the developers aren't ignoring it and misusing it. And of course, test cases can also verify that they're not ignoring it or using it incorrectly, because the test case should verify that the mechanism actually works. So how do you do test cases for security controls? Well, for standalone components, a lot of time you can build test cases for them. And in fact, we've proven that you can do it at least to some degree with the SAPI, because the SAPI was built with test-driven development in mind. So we've built over 600 test cases as part of the construction of a SAPI. And that's been incredibly useful for us, not only for building it in the first place, but as we make changes, and Jeff Williams is in the room, I think he's in the room, I thought I saw him come in. Yep. As he's making changes, re-architecting the internals and making it more efficient and more modular and easier to use, those test cases have saved him countless times from introducing subtle flaws, or bugs, that he might not have noticed if he had not had that huge test case to support the work that he's been doing. So we've seen that you can do it. And once you've got that, then think about that. You as a developer, when you bring in the component in your project, you can run the base test suite to make sure you didn't break anything in terms of the core components. And then you need to build your own test cases on top to make sure that you're actually using the components correctly and where they need to be used. But imagine if you've got that test suite built, then imagine over time as you continue to manage and maintain your application, you're probably going to move stuff around and you're going to break the way you use certain components, and those tests are going to go, whoops, you just screwed up the access control on that thing, it doesn't work anymore. Oh, I got to go back and fix it, as an example. So not only does it help you with maintenance, but this is a huge benefit in terms of assurance. So I mean, this lends itself towards a model where we can build security into an Agile project with high assurance, just like we can build high functional assurance through Agile with driven development. So when you're building these test cases as a developer, you need to build the functional test cases for functional security components, like does it actually log something? So you would build a test case that says, I generate an event, it causes a security event, and then I verify that this entry showed up in the log as an example. You should try to build security test cases for things that it shouldn't do, which is obviously harder. Developers are not used to writing negative test cases. It's hard to test for all the things that something shouldn't be able to do. And we recognize that, right? So they should do the best they can. Again, this regression testing is really useful. And then I think some independent security testing is, of course, worth considering, again, depending on the importance of the application. So that independent tester that I mentioned before that you need for all non-functional requirements, they should be doing security testing. And so if they can literally be doing at least a little bit of security testing in every sprint, you can catch things earlier, which is obviously cheaper. That's the whole model. We're trying to, in everything OWASP is doing, we're trying to say push left, push left. So the earlier you can find problems, the cheaper it is to fix them. So again, you may not have an external security testing resource that is available, right? You either may not have one at all, or that person is so busy that you can't apply them to your particular project. And so that goes back to your sort of risk management for your entire application. If your application is like the critical app that your whole business runs on, then that guy's probably going to be priority is to work on your project. If you're doing it on some less important application, maybe that step in your process just doesn't happen on that particular project.
Are there methodologies available though for those that type of testing?
For security testing? Sorry.
People shouldn't be expected to follow.
Yeah, OWASP has a security testing guide, and they actually have a code analysis guide too. So, I mean, the best resource that's publicly available that I am aware of is those two right now. And then, I mean, there's lots of books and tons of, and there's tools, and I'll talk about tools a little bit in a second. So, but at least the published documents on how to do security testing, the OWASP testing guide is probably the biggest resource available today.
The tools can't do the business logic.
Absolutely, right. I mean, I'll talk about tools later a little bit. I think there's a place for tools, but there's a lot of things they can't test for, of course.
So I've looked at the OWASP testing guide, but
Yeah.
it is not at all tailored to Agile practices. It's more, I don't think it's got an Agile flavor in it. So I've gone through it as a group. I don't know.
Yeah, it's definitely not focused on any particular development paradigm, right? So it just says, if you want to test for this problem, like cross-site scripting or SQL injection or access control, this is how you do it, right? It's not focused on any particular paradigm. Yes, that's right. That's right. So if you decide the way you prioritize your tasks that you want to have a whole sprint focused on security, that would be great. I mean, in an ideal world, you'd never have to do it. And you just plow on building functionality, and you would use your standard components, and you wouldn't slow down that much to build security into your application. I'm not going to say you're going to get security for free. It's never going to be for free. Our goal is to get it to be as reasonably inexpensive and as reasonably non-obtrusive to the process as we can possibly get.
Just an observation, in past successes that I've seen, no one is actually building an application that stands alone. It fits into some context. So
right.
Rather than saying, oh, this is the security stuff you got to do, I've seen successful scenarios, say in like a broker workstation, where you have a portal structure, regardless of how you implement it.
Right.
And it has rules about how you may play in that space. And guess what? Half of them are security or identity related, but they can't get in unless they do it. So I wasn't the bad cop. I was just helping them to get into the real world. So maybe that's an approach that, and you could have a sprint. I'm not, you could have a sprint where you talk about, let's create the structure that we're going to be in, or let's create the user story about how you get into the structure or something.
Well, I really think that when you're doing at the very beginning, when you're thinking about the application and the functionality, you're clearly thinking about the environment it's going to go in and the infrastructure it's going to be placed in, right? So we do a lot of work with big financial clients, and they have most of them have a very significant infrastructure. And it's not just security, it's thou shalt use WebSphere, and thou shalt use whatever, and there's a huge litany of thou shalts do, right? So when you're building an Agile app in those environments, clearly you have to take that into account, otherwise you're going to completely fail. It just won't drop in. Well, so as part of that, of course, it's got all kinds of security features in it. It typically has authentication. It typically has an authorization system, which you, of course, have to configure to make sense for your app, but it's there. So clear, and when I say standard components, that's what I mean. If your environment does some standard security stuff, use it, right? And the more standard stuff that just comes with it, the less you got to worry about when you do development, right?
That's especially in the case of SOA security, where you're linking to a security service.
Yeah, I mean, when you move into a true services-oriented world, like SOA, and web services may or may not be in a services world, but in a SOA environment where you've got standard security components, you know, you're more and more encouraged. So I've actually worked with a defense contractor, for example, and they're relatively mature in the SOA services world to have all kinds of really great security services that people can use because they recognize that building all these yourselves was insane. But then you go to the web world, and they have no security standards, which is kind of interesting. It seems like, well, this one was first, and this was next. Your maturity should have gone from older to newer, but that's kind of where they are. 5 minutes? Okay. So in an ideal world, you wouldn't have a security sprint because you have so much significant infrastructure that you wouldn't even conceive of pausing for 3 to 4 weeks to focus just on security. But when you're new and you don't have a lot of infrastructure and you got to build a security component, maybe this makes sense. You're going to build several components together, or you decide to weave it in. It's all based on your prioritization scheme with respect to your stories, both security and functional stories, right? So then we think some security reviews are in order, right? Now we got to figure out how do we do reviews in a way that's not a bomb in the middle of the process that disrupts everything, right? So having a security tester that is involved as you go a little bit, if you can, is good. A periodic, certainly with the threat modeling and the security requirements, you're sort of doing some upfront planning. Again, it's not the heavyweight planning of waterfall where you're going, let's get every requirement out to the endless detail. We want to get the buckets of security requirements, prioritize those, and then when we get to that bucket, then we figure out the details in that particular sprint. So, and then of course doing code review and pen testing at the end, makes sense because it's, it's not in the middle. Again, it's going to obviously affect deployment, right? I can't conceive of a way that you can imagine doing security and having zero impact on schedule. I mean, it's just impossible, right? But we want to figure out a way so we're not inserting 5 extra days out of every 3-week sprint or something, because that is going to make the whole process 25% longer, right? So we want to make it 5% longer or something by weaving it through and then understanding we have a gating effort at the end. And if we've been doing it all along the way, then that review at the end is going to be hopefully perfunctory, right? Where you just go, yeah, we're just verifying that we did all the good stuff we're supposed to do, and they'll find stuff. It always happens, but hopefully it's not major, and then they can take some risk analysis and go, well, we got some issues, but schedule's important and whatever, so we might decide to go live, and then we're going to fix that in the next release or whatever. So that's just the way you do risk management anyway, right? So these are just a couple ways to weave it in without being disruptive. So a simple example that it was an observation that came to us recently. We were working with on an application, and it's got a very complicated access control policy. We're envisioning like 4 or 5 different roles, and some of them are hierarchical, and some of them are independent. Like you have different kinds of administrators, different kinds of users, and we're building the application, and the developer's like, well, I don't want to get started building this app until I understand the policy, because that policy could massively affect how I build the application. And I'm like, that doesn't sound right, because I want to do Agile, right? I want to get the app in front of the customer, get them to see it, like it, decide what's in, drop things that they don't like, add new things, change all kinds of stuff, and try to figure out the policy for all that stuff that we haven't built yet is a little premature. So what we said was, look, let's put the security checks for access control in the app as we build it. So when you put a button on the screen that might be optional based on privileges, make sure you check to sure if that button should be displayed. When the function's actually invoked, whether it's the page or the business function, check to see if they're authorized. But then your policy says all allowed, right? So you can just build your app, get the functionality done, and then at some point later on, you can either partially figure out your policy or completely figure out your policy at the end. So you might say, well, we're kind of halfway through and the functionality is stabilizing, and we want to make sure we got all access control in there right. So let's figure out the policy for the 2 or 3 normal user roles, put that into the policy store, and then see what happens. You know, just see if the buttons show up or not that they're supposed to, and test to see if things are good on. And that's when you're actually going to implement your security tests that verify that you got your security checks in the right place. Because you can't build those tests beforehand, because if they're always allowing access when it's like a user trying an admin function, that test will clearly break. So here's your chance to configure your policy and then build your test cases to verify that you're actually doing what you're doing, but you haven't done a massive re-architecture of your app to build access control in. And this supports both declarative and programmatic access control, right? So if you're using something like SiteMinder or any other filter that protects pages based on roles, you can implement that policy later. And then you can also use, hopefully you're using the same policy to drive how you do access control inside of your application. So in summary, I really think you can do this. It's going to require a lot of structure in an agile way. I mean, I'm not, again, not heavyweight. You're going to need to build these artifacts that makes you faster. So I already talked about standard components and coding guidelines and training and security experts being helpful. But all the other processes that you're doing that are related to security, you need artifacts for too. So threat modeling, you need a process for how to do threat modeling. You need some example threat models, some example stakeholder security stories. And in fact, if you're building similar kinds of apps, and web apps tend to be very similar to each other, as you start building a library of stakeholder security stories and the threat models for that, the next one and the next one and the next one and the next one get easier. And as your security controls library grows, you can take those stories and map them to your standard controls and go, here's the stories, and oh, by the way, those are all solved, except this is how you integrate it into a new app. And it gets easier over time. But you have to be really focused on how I'm going to reuse what I'm doing from security on this project to the next, and this project to the next. So we have to figure out how to succeed with reuse from a security perspective. Otherwise, I think you're kind of doomed to build secure, agile projects because it's just too expensive. So that's it. I don't know how much time we have, but I'll take a few questions. No time. Well, we'll take a couple questions and then we'll go. So I know we already had some in the audience. All right, any more? No? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I actually just want to talk about tools in general. So I think, and Jim Ralph mentioned this at the panel yesterday, in an ideal world, your developers would be writing code, and they'd hit compile or save, and the little red line would show up under that line of code saying, you know, spelling error right here, but that doesn't mean spelling error, it means security bug, right? That's what we want to get to, right? Now, clearly tools can only do that to a certain degree. But if they can help you stop certain things, I think that could be very useful to you. I actually think once you get a secure coding standard in place, you could use simple tools to verify your standard. So if you're using any quality tools or even simple things as simple as Eclipse, you can write rules on what's allowed. And those tools could verify that, no, I don't have any dynamic queries generated. And yes, I'm always using my security controls and not this banned set of controls that might be natively available in this component that I don't want anyone to use anymore. So I think tools have a place for them. Obviously, there's a cost-benefit issue with the the true security analysis tools that from Mounts and Fortify and those guys. But I think that's definitely coming and it's worth considering. But I think you can do some basic security analysis with relatively inexpensive quality tools today to at least move yourself forward. And the more it's built in automatic, obviously, the more agile you are. So that was a great question. Anything else? Otherwise,
just one thing real quick. I think you made a really important point when you said that if you have to do a security sprint, then you fail. And I think that's something that we really, really need to focus on. I think it's general failure how we think about we do development. Because what we're doing is saying to developers that you don't need to think about this until the security team comes to you and says, this is the problem. It really needs to be a part of every single sprint. And it is to the point where you have to have a security sprint that you haven't done.
well, I'm not implying that the security sprints completely replaces the security you should have been doing up front. So I wouldn't use as strong words as, if you have a security sprint, you fail. But if you're trying to use a security sprint to make up for no security up to that point, I would agree with you, right? So if it works out that your prioritization of your story says it makes sense to put these security things all together, and we're really going to focus on that because we got to build, 2 different security components, and let's just get them all done at once, then that's just how you prioritize everything. But obviously your customer is going to have to be convinced that it's worth to spend 3 or 4 weeks doing just security. And that may not be appetizing for them. All right, I got to go. Thank you.